round for the tournament. This is going to be a semi-final round between Tropical and John Lyon. For this round, Tropical's defending that gender should be abolished. John Lyon's defending that it should not be abolished. Since it's a semi-final round, the participants will have 50 minutes to debate. If we reach 50 minutes and they have not finished, then we will cut them off, and then we will put it to a voting poll in which you, the audience, can decide on who you think performed better overall in the debate. Thank you both for debating. You can get started.
I can make an opening statement, or you can, whatever you like.
Because I'm holding whatever. You can start. You can start.
Okay. So I'm gonna go ahead and just put. Let me cut and paste this because I just typed it out. In debate chat, I'm just gonna put what we're understanding gender to be, and then you can disagree with that if you want.
After quickly reading through it, because I can't spend all day reading it, because I would do, I will have to agree with that, and yeah, we can both.
I can break it down real quick if you'd like.
Yeah, that would probably be better, because
Yeah,
I'm not good with
basically,
my reading.
I'm basically just saying like gender, and everything related to gender is like a human construct. Like we came up with it. It's not like inherent within nature or reality. Like what we identify biological sex to be. But it just basically we have like these different culturally accepted understandings of like the current genders, and like there's some indoctrinations as to what those genders are and what purposes they're meant to serve and whatnot. But it's all essentially just a construct of our human culture. Would you
Yeah,
disagree with that?
I'll have to agree with that.
Okay, cool. So I'll just make a quick opening statement then, and you can respond to that, and then we'll go back and forth on that. So essentially, I don't have a issue with gender being abolished because, um, without getting too like in depth, I mean, we can break it apart as we debate, but the the human thought process, I would say, is not a very complex one, and I'm not referring to like the neurological structure or how the electricity functions in the brain. I'm saying more like you know it's not too dense of a thought process from thought to thought, like oh, I'm hungry, I gotta go to the bathroom, oh, what would I feel like doing today? No, that's boring. Point to point basic. That's kind of how our mind kind of processes thought. So and we're very focal, like we can't have too many things that we're focusing on at one time, and we can't like I don't know the best way to describe it, but like how a processor, like a computer, can multitask like 50 different programs at the same time. Just it'll go slow depending on resources and power. Like human beings can't really function that same way. We have our minimal uh, processes that we're capable of, and some are up and down on that, but for the most part, it's within a reasonable spectrum of our existence. That it's not so complex. What I'm saying is like over our species development as human beings, we've kind of evolved that process at a reasonable pace. And in the beginning, we had our tribal thought process and our tribal roles and whatnot. And as we've moved into the modern era of like the peak of our cultural existence, we have like governmental systems in place, capital systems in place for finance and resources. We're at like I would say the peak of our developmental process, and in that specific point in time, we utilize compartmentalized thought processes or identifiers in order to communicate effectively. We use the English language that we've developed over time, well, multiple languages over the planet that we've developed over time, and they've evolved over time. But as our thought processes are simple, our ability to communicate is limited to varying degrees. So we culturally develop these methods of communicating, to summarize or to save time or things like that. So like an example of that is compartmentalized identifiers, like a gender identifier. Like so since gender is a social construct, essentially gender, like I put in debate chat, whatever gender would have whatever subset requirements, expectations and or expressions to meet that compartmentalized identifier. So, like say a man, for example, an existing gender that's socially accepted in our culture. In order to be, a man. So this is where like gender is a very interesting thing. It's like, as it's a social construct, there's variable identifiers and there's variations, but there's also generals. And so the whole point of it is simplicity in communication, where if you are a variation, you're obviously going to have to explain that variation. But if you're not a variation, and what I mean by that is if like the socially accepted, generals for what a man would be is like, a man is typically biologically male. A man typically is more physical and is less emotional, things like that. And whereas if you're born biologically male, or you're born and other things, that exist within that male identifier, even if those relate to you, it doesn't necessarily mean you're forced to be in that category. So like these are just social identifiers. So if for whatever reason you're born and you relate to the uh, um, the identifier male in terms of like what it's socially accepted to be, like more into physical activity, you know uh I don't know, less emotional, whatever I said earlier. If for whatever reason that relates to you, for simplicity communication, you can identify yourself as a man. And the same vice versa with woman. And for whatever reason, if you're a variable, you can come up with your own gender to identify yourself as. And eventually it could either be socially accepted or not. And if it's not, you'll just have to explain it until it is. Social acceptance just means it's understood for the most part. And there's no harm towards it. That's what I would say. So that's a very long opener, but we can go ahead and you can do whatever you'd like, and we can break it down as we go.
Okay, yeah, that was a great opening. I might reply now and then a bit late, so if you want me to interrupt or take on, just say, because I write down quite slowly, and when it comes for me to speak, I'll take 2 seconds to actually unmute. But yeah, I'm going to go down through what you've said, break it down as well as I can, and explain over what I'm going to do. First of all, what I wrote down, I was somewhat getting it when you're saying gender of like a person, male or whatever they were. You're trying to get that's how they are perceived in their social lives. So that person over there, they do this sort of thing, which I would insinuate is that sort of gender. Is that what you're trying to get at?
Yeah, sorry, I was taking a drink of water.
Okay.
Yeah, essentially, it's just for simplicity of communication. Some people that exist in our culture desire to have identifiers, or things that represent who they are as a person in order to simplify communication. So while some people don't want to be a man or a woman or whatever, some people do relate to those identifier constructs and want to be, use them, or be seen as them, or whatever the terminology, for simplicity of communication. So people know that that's what they identify as.
Okay, I'm gonna have to disagree with that, with how simplicity plays into that. When we are diving into the whole world of gender, gender is what we, like you say, a social construct, which means it's a social understanding of that person's that sort of thing. But from place to place where you go, social will be a completely different thing. This person could think socially that that is that, or overall, social isn't a perfect exact point, and there'll be so many different fragments of the same person or gender identifier that when we say simplicity, we can't simply just say, "Oh, you're the boy." We don't always know that the boy is this tough man that goes to the gym every day. We can't have so many precise measurements that we can simply compact down into one gender identifier. And if we could, there would be too many for it to actually be called simple or even close to it, because we would have to have a vast range of different gender identifiers for them to all be somewhat categorized.
Okay, yeah. So we're in a kind of a transitional period in our human consciousness. Because like I would say, typically in the past, I don't know, 100 years or 1,000 years or whatever, there wasn't really like in our social uh, understanding, like in our method of communicating with each other and identifying each other, there wasn't really many variations in terms of gender. There was essentially the man and the woman. And as I said, human beings are simplistic in their thought process. And I don't think that the majority of people, at least early in our consciousness development, we're able to see the more in depth picture of the situation where, no, don't conflate scientific understandings of biology with social constructs of identification of the personality. And now, as we're transitioning into that, we're starting to, like, as we're consciously developing as a species, as we evolve, we're starting to be able to see that more big picture and realize, well, wait a minute, we have these terms that we use for science to identify specific functionalities. But also, we have social versions of that. Said this for the same purpose of communication and identification. We also have social versions of that. But we're starting to transition into an understanding that those are not um, definitive. They're not concrete like laws, and they're actual just social constructs that we can either choose to use or not, or develop new ones that, as we develop and become more complex as a species and start to want to use different identifiers as we become more, complex in our individuality or whatnot. But we can still use that social construct of identification for our use of communication. It may be at the point where we develop into a species where we telepathically communicate with each other and we can just feel and understand what each other are to each other, then we wouldn't have to use identifiers for communication's sake.
So I kind of have to, I agree and disagree with your biology thing. With a biology sense, we can actually understand. We've got physical matter that we can test and go. I know broccoli will go against me by saying there's an XY chromosome for male and a double Y or double X for female. There's many different biological things we can definitely say this is that person, that is that sort of person. They are male, they are female, or they are either of those two. When we get into the social thing, it is such a vague understanding. And if we're going to take every human to be a unique person or a unique set of people, we can't group them up into big gendered identifiers, because all you're doing to them is stripping them of their uniqueness.
That's an interesting point. I'm going to try to break that down. While I would say that from a scientific perspective, it would probably be confusing or difficult to have, multiple biological sexes or variations in the species. But typically, we have not that many. We have, like, typical male, female, sometimes intersex, sometimes we have some deformities or variations, and but that's just a product of the developmental stage being affected by radiation, radio frequencies, like whatever, all the factors that go into play with that. But for the most part, we just have the our simple variations that we can identify using our scientific terminology. And it's important to do that in science because it makes the process of assisting the patient, whether it's emergency situation or a patient comes in for a private checkup or whatever, it assists in the communication as well as understanding, uh, what organs are available. You know what I mean, like a scientific. But from the social construct, it's simply expression. It's communication. There is no necessity for it like there is in science. So you can accept it or you cannot. It's like a whatever. If it relates to you, then you can use it. If it's simplistic for your communication. If it doesn't relate to you, you can choose not to. If you want to communicate a gender or whatever, but there isn't one that exists and you're becoming more complex, well, then you can come up with your own version and you can do your best to communicate that to everybody else. I mean, it's going to be tough having it culturally accepted as a normal, or not. I say normal with quotes, like it'll be difficult to have it culturally accepted the same way, the ones that are already culturally accepted are. But there's nothing to say that it's incorrect to do, and there's nothing to say that it would be ineffective in your communication if you were to break it down, if someone were to ask questions.
Yeah. So I want to like jab at you with you said like with a new genders, it's going to be hard to incorporate them into society. Yeah. I'm not going to try and manipulate your words. Is that what you sort of said?
Yeah, it would be hard. It would be difficult if it was a minority thing. Like there was a minimal, like say you come up with your own gender that's like, I don't know, make up a word and then that's the gender, and you're the only one that seems to identify as it, or you're in a niche group or a small identifier group that feels like that matches them. um, it would be a difficult task to have the rest of the population accept it the same way that they accept, the existing genders like man and woman. Not to say that it would be impossible, not to say that it would even be necessary. Just, a foregoing, like if you decide that this is what you want to do with the language, just be aware of the effects that it'll have or what you'll have to deal with.
But that's the thing. When we talk about this huge, the major thing, and we're talking about it now, is like it's just a little sort of thing that happens. A gender identifier will be a major key part of communication. It'll be the way we talk to people. It is all of this stuff. So when we need to have stuff like creating a new one to suit this sort of person, so they're not getting pushed to the side, we're not this I forgot what it's called. We're not basically splitting them up from the rest of the world, and we're not pushing them to the side. We want to add everyone together. We need to be able to have a system where we say you're allowed into this gender identifier thing. Here's your new gender. But we can't do that for everyone, like you said. It will be extremely hard, and all it's going to do is cause chaos, and people are going to be like, "Why don't you accept this? Why don't you accept that?" Then there's going to be a load of people that are going to be trolling that want their own troll gender identifiers. And when and if it does become a major thing, we're gonna people are gonna start pushing for laws. They're gonna be asking for uh, if you don't call me by my gender identifier pronouns, have you'll be punished in some sort of way, and all of this is going to cascade further and further until you can't express your wording to another person without having every single word in your sentence perfect, which, to be honest, will never work. And all it's going to do is bring chaos with communications through social social interaction. And I feel that when we're trying to add new genders or trying to suit it for everyone, it's just going to cause major chaos. And the social construct part is just social construct is built on itself. It doesn't require further pushing of this and that. It just builds as it does. You won't have to meddle with it. It's a constant thing that happens over time, and you won't be able to incorporate all these different people when it's just a social construct. So all I'm going to take it as is the more you push this theory of everyone has their uniqueness and its simplicity, all it's going to do is push people further away, because those people that want their unique identifier are not going to actually be able to push it into this society. And that is going to make them or that person less happy to be within this group. And it can push them even further to even worse scenarios than they currently are. People talk about oppression when nowadays, if you can't stick to the people's pronouns, you're oppressing their right to be called or having their identifier. If we keep this up and we push for gender identifiers, all it's going to do is going to make everyone have to use these perfect pronouns, perfect identifiers. If you misgender them or miss whatever, all it's going to do is call you out for being oppression against that sort of person, and all it's doing is causing havoc. Where if we just remove the gender part out of it and we use the basic form of he or she or them for the unknown, which most cases, like you said, there's only a few deformities where it's radiation or there's just a small part, but normally there's biological, either major female things, or you can always determine whether it's more of a female than a male. If not, we can just call them them. So you've got him, her, them, and then no one has to feel left out because they've got their own category. We don't have to add any more, because if we're going to add more, it's going to cause major chaos. We don't have to remove because that is suited to be perfect. And the number 3 is perfect.
Yeah, unfortunately, not everybody agrees with that. That's why we have so many people saying they don't identify with, he, her, them, whatever. And they identify with their own specific thing. But let me break down everything, or try to respond to everything you said. The reason why it's important to have definitive identifiers in terms of biological sex is because it's used for science or medicine, and you need efficiency and consistency, because you're working through a process. Then you're either medically assisting a human being, or you're going through a scientific experiment or process. So having those definitive understandings is important for that. But where gender is a personality identifier, it's solely, we have an accepted understanding of what it is throughout our culture because we're simplistic in our thought process and we're developing. I think humans are pretty egotistical in the fact that they think, I would say the majority of humans, feel like we're really advanced and we're really developmentally, you know, uh, complex and like in depth and like way more, we're so different from the animals. And but in reality, we're very focal in our thought process, and we only within our lifetimes only kind of focus on the a few years at a time in terms of like looking at a picture of understanding a reality. Like we're focusing on like, oh, it's chaos, and we're coming up with new genders and it's crazy. That's like we're looking at like 20 years of the hundreds of thousands of years that humans have developed mentally and evolutionally. Like we just a few thousand years ago got to the point where we could have cultural civilizations and have like governmental systems, and that was just a few thousand years ago. And we've slowly started to evolve our language, and just like the process of evolution, the reason we have people with more complex you know identifier desires and thought processes, and they feel more individual, is because we're complexifying as a species as we evolve, and we're moving out of the simplistic versions of our ideas and understandings into the more complex version. So we came up with language as a species, then we came up with the understanding of gender in order to identify each other personally. Simplistically, in our developmental time period, we saw it to the point where it was culturally indoctrinated that they were definitive to some degree. But as we're developing as a species, and there's variations to our development because we have hindrances to that development. We have wars, we have disasters, catastrophes, whatever. So it's not a perfect development at the same time. But as we're going through this development, we're becoming more complex in our thought process, and we're starting to see the grander picture. We're starting to dissociate the personality construct from the scientific definitive construct, and we're starting to recognize that this personality construct is simply a communication tool. It's not definitive. It's not, and there are still some people that will disagree with that. But like I said, we're evolving slowly, and we're only looking at about 20 years of history versus I don't know how many thousands of years humans have developed. But it's a transitional period where it's like, oh, no, no. But in the reality, as we're evolving as a species and improving our understanding of thought, we're recognizing that it's just a simplistic language tool used to communicate what you personality wise identify as to another human being. And if you either subscribe to the ones that are already, from our past development, or as we're developing in a new stage of consciousness, you can, come up with your own that's unique to yours, or collectively as groups of individuals that, relate to each other, come up with them. And as that develops, maybe they'll become socially accepted, or they won't be, and that's just a part of our development. And in terms of laws and things like that, that's just that would be the structure of our law system. And does that affect freedom of speech and whatnot? And that's just a different debate, honestly.
Okay, yeah, I'll take that last part of law as a completely different thing. I think I got sidetracked more in my head. But okay, I'm going to go through what you said. I've got 3 major points, and then you can reply. So first, you said something about how biology, when we were talking about biology, you said, and you can always re-say it unless you might have messed up, but when we're talking about biology, when we have the gender, we've got male, female, and unknown, or the other one. That is the most efficient way for a scientist or biologist to go, that's a new body part for you, that's a new body part for you. And when we group them into those categories, it's extremely efficient. And that's why I also say, when we're talking or communicating, it's extremely efficient to say that, or that. If we add extra 100 tons of gender pronouns, all it's going to do is cause a load of communication errors. And what I feel myself is we don't need a new system in place to convey how people emotionally speak, how they act, how they function. Because everyone, like I said before, everyone is unique. Everyone has their own set of brain waves. They were born, they have a whole new life system. They might be similar, but they're not the same. And I feel that when I'm talking to people, I don't understand who they are until I remember their name. And their name is what grasps what I take of them. If someone says a name to you, then you have a new idea in your head of who they are, how they act, how they do stuff. So when we try and bring gender identifiers, all we're doing is rewriting a whole other system, which is going to, it's just not needed. When we've got names or identifiers already in place, we don't need an extra system on top of that that is just going to cause a load of chaos. And that was kind of 2 points in one. Evolution, you're talking about that and how we're progressing, and 100% we are progressing a lot. We are never, and I will never say this, we are never going to be perfect. We probably want to be perfect. Most humans will probably say we probably are already very good and sentient, all this bullshit, but we are not there. And I feel that when you bring this gender identifier into the evolution stage of how we're progressing, I wouldn't say because it's evolution and because it's progression, it is any good. You did say yourself that there are terrible things that we're progressing towards. There's nuclear bombs that we're currently building. You've got Kim Jong Un, who's blowing up everyone. You've got Donald Trump firing Trump's missiles back, and evolution, I would say, isn't a good like a good base for saying that anything is actually good. So when we're when we're evolving and creating these new gender identifiers, I would say that that's not actually a good or any valid explanation for why we should accept this gender identification system.
Right. So let me touch on those points. First of all, I didn't bring up evolution to say that necessarily everything we're evolving into is good. I'm saying as a part of our evolution, we progress and become more complex as a species in terms of our thought process. That's what I was saying essentially. And then I was also using it for reference of a timeline we've been going through evolution for hundreds of thousands of years. But like we're only focusing on, the gender construct starting to shift in the past like 20 years, which is like a grain of sand in our timeline, essentially is what I'm saying. So like basing off what's happening now and saying it's going to lead to cultural chaos is why I'm saying it doesn't seem appropriate. But to touch on the scientific part, those terms, like I said earlier, are for definitive purposes, for the sake of medicine or science. But personalities are not definitive. Human beings are different from each other in how they are and how they act and what they like, what they dislike, how they respond to stimuli. Our personalities are not definitive. And whereas they were more general in our developmental timeline, like say 1,000 years ago, 100,000 years ago, maybe we were more typically one or two or three different kind of personality types or whatever. And as we develop and become more complex as a species, we start to have more complex variations, and we will have to unfortunately evolve. And this is an interesting thing why we talked about evolution, how you said, it doesn't necessarily point to anything that's good, and that it's going to be chaos implementing a new system. So gender is not it's not a system. Would be like, like a financial system or a governmental system, like a regulatory check and balance, divisive system where gender is just a communication tool. It's a personality identifier, and it doesn't have to be definitive. It doesn't have to be. It's only simplistic if the understanding behind the identifier, like the knowledge behind the identifier, is understood. And if it's not, if there's a disagreement on it, then that's solved through communication, just like every other aspect of reality. And we've naturally developed these identifiers as we've developed our communication. And you wouldn't have to implement a new system. As the species is becoming more complex, you either have to adapt and evolve, or, there's no other option. So we're generating more and more offspring that are becoming more and more adaptable to these social understandings of gender being separate from sex and things like that. Whereas people from older generations are not so accepting of that and whatnot. Well, that's simply a part of the evolutionary process. As the species develops more complex, it's more accepting of understandings and things like that, and the grander picture becomes more aware. So you wouldn't have to implement any type of a system or anything like that. It's simply making the language tool more complex, which goes along with how the species becomes more complex.
So you've I don't know, you probably, my head's probably spinning right now, but you've just said that the gender whatever is making the communication more complex, when before you were saying that it's more simple, simplis, oh, fuck, more simplified or more simple.
No, yeah, it is for simplicity terms. Like it, the only reason I'm saying the language is becoming more complex as we evolve as a species and we become more complex individually. We would have to adapt our terms and identifiers. But that's just a part of the process. Whereas, like, maybe we didn't even have man and woman identifiers, until tribal times. You see what I'm saying? Like, maybe we just were ooga and booga to each other or whatever. You know what I mean?
So one thing I'd majorly say, if gender, and you probably may agree or disagree, if gender is such a big thing for humans to communicate, why has this never been implemented before? Why haven't we ever evolved into this state of being able to communicate via this gender identification?
What do you mean? We've been using it for thousands of years.
We normally use male, female, and they.
Oh, are you saying why is it becoming more complex now?
Yeah. So why is now because you were saying that
Because we're
we're
evolving as a
evolving into this thing,
species.
but that's the thing. We've had to my knowledge, about 400,000. No shit. We've had a few thousand years to develop into this stage of using communication skills. Why is it taken only to now for us to actually start communicating? Whereas what I see is development or evolution currently is using computers or being able to build computers and stuff like that, or maybe using instruments. As we develop slowly and slowly, we'll be doing more precise, more very small differences, which overall will build up. Whereas I take having a whole new, or not a whole new, but a extreme addition to the gender identification is such a big evolutional change. Why is that coming now when we've had many years to change to it?
Well, so that's what I'm saying. It's like we haven't had many years. We've been developing over hundreds of thousands of years, and we've only gotten to the peak of our cultural existence in the past like 6,000 years, which is like nothing in terms of the timeline. And it's only rapidly increasing as we collectively unify as a species. Before, in our beginning, we were all separate from each other, living tribal. We started to develop over thousands of years cultures, communities. Together with these cultures, communities, we started to break certain hindrances. We applied some hindrances with like war and miscommunication and stuff like that. But the majority of developmental hindrances are being scattered from each other, having minimal to no resources, having no environment to develop in. Whereas in the past few thousand years, we've been rapidly increasing our ability to develop with our what's the term, conveniences that our culture provides. You know, uh, instead of having to spend your entire life surviving day to day, you can spend time thinking and developing your mind, which is what we've slowly been able to do as a species as we've gathered together and unified. And now we're to the point where the entire planet, for the most part, despite rural regions, really terrible condition third world countries, or tribal, still existing tribal islands or whatever, despite that small sliver of the population, the majority of the human population is interconnected with each other with our modern technology. And as we further that, the arc of development rapidly increases. It's like I don't know the best way to describe that shape, where it's like a gradual increase and then it rapidly starts to ascend as we have more methods of increasing that developmental momentum or whatever. So that we're just in that time period where we're starting to consciously understand through our connective ability to connect with each other and communicate with each other. We're starting to understand that these concepts that we've had through our development are not definitive, and we can further develop them. And it's not implementing a whole new system. And the majority of the people that exist within the current understanding do not have to transition at all. And it's just inevitable that our species will transition. Our understanding.
Oh, sugar. My brain just reset itself. So yeah. Um, while my brain trying to remembers what you've just said, because you just did a stutter as hell. I love my memory, but luckily I wrote a few things down. I think like before my thing last time, you said something about how well, not our children. I'm too young to have children yet. Fuck them. But our parents' children and some of my, I wouldn't call them friends, but people I know, they are introducing this whole new gender identification, and they're all loving this thing. Um, just because this new population of children or our uh, offspring, there we go, our offspring, just because they're accepting this new identification doesn't mean it's any good or any help. Uh, we, as the older group or the older group, which you said are saying that it's negative or whatever, we should be teaching them, and this is not pushing it on them, but we should be teaching them how it is and how to learn and how to gradually become better at being how to communicate, how to do all this. So we're when we're allowing them to add this new gender identification, where we're we're giving a whole new wording or new identification, like say, to a set of people or a certain person, all we're doing is becoming lazy with how we speak, because we've already got words in place which can do this. We've got better ways of doing this. All we're doing is creating a very lazy form of identification. Like I said before, we've got names. Names is my only way of identifying people. I can't visually see faces and understand who they are. I can't understand people's voices. If you speak to me and someone else speaks to me, I think I'm speaking to the same person. The only way I can identify different people is via their names. But if we start bringing in stuff like gender identification, all that's going to do is group more people up together, which we've got stuff like male, female to group those major things up together. When we want to know how people are, how they feel, how they're doing something, how I perceive someone, I will use their name to understand them. I will look at you and say, "You're John Lyon. You do this. You do that," and that brings it all to my head. We don't have to have a whole new gender identification system where all it's going to do is add a load of laziness of and complexity to a very simple system we already have. And I think just because the newer generation are taking hold of this doesn't mean it's any good. I think it's more of the older generation are becoming extremely lazy and not teaching the newer generation all of these ways of communication. Because, well, one of the major things of this is technology. Technology has made everyone so lazy because nowadays we can just message people online. We can text, we can call, and all of this has made humans extremely lazy. There's word counts, so now we have to abbreviate words, we have to shorten everything down, we have to use some weird spelling of perfectly working words. Now, socially, people understand these words, but when it comes to actually progressing, those words don't mean anything. Those stuff, all it is a social little identification to that, which has just become lazy, irrelevant, and we need to go back to the system where we can truly take a word and mean it. So instead of having abbreviations, we shouldn't be lazy about having it all shortened down. Maybe sometimes we should, because that might be more efficient. But if we want to get our straight points across, we need to be precise. We need to be saying exactly what it is. Where if we want to go through how people are acting or how they are, we can use their name, or we can talk about them in their different ways. If we're talking about what gender or how they appear in the community, that can all be put into their name. If someone says my name in public, they all know that I'm a silly person that goes around making funny jokes. They don't need a whole set of stupid, well, I shouldn't say stupid, but they don't need a whole set of gender identifications to understand that I'm the stupid one of the group.
Um, I want to address your points, but I just reread the proposition and I'm confused now. Because it sounds like we're debating whether it's okay that our understanding of gender evolves versus it needs to stay exactly the same. But I thought we were debating whether it's okay that we use gender to identify ourselves. And you're
Do
supposed
you
to
know
be
the difference
debating
between
we're
sex and
not.
gender?
Yes,
Because look,
I
so
understand the difference between biological sex and gender.
yeah, so if we've got the biological sex, gender, no, sex. I don't know why gender came into play. Sex, we can go that person's got this sort of body, whatever. That person's got that sort of body. That is a set thing we can talk to about, yeah? If we're going to talk about this person, we can use the given words of male, female, or that person, but we don't need to have all these new identification to start it. And we already need to get rid of most of the identifications already, because I don't know how far your social interaction is or how you talk with people, but in my community, there are so many different gender identifications already, which are just absurd and just not needed to have a conversation. And they are making something simple, like a normal hello conversation, to something where we have to guess all these pronouns or whatever like that. But pronouns is different subject and all that.
Honestly, this just boils down to me seeing it as like, there's no issue with having gender identifiers. They're not definitive, and then no one, like, the only way that you would be forced to conform is if it was, inducted in law. And if that's an issue to you, then you should look at how your law system functions in the country that you live in. Because the way I see it is people can either identify as man, they can identify as women, or as we become more complex as a species and we have people born that do not identify as those, or our understanding of what those identifiers even represent becomes more complex, people will change whether they want to identify with them or not. And if there are not terms for what they want to identify as, humans, just like we developed our own language, have the freedom to develop their own identifiers and express to other human beings through communication what those identifiers are and what they represent to that individual. And just like we have disagreements on the identifiers we have in reality, and we have a ton of them, we have gender identifiers, we have political identifiers, we have social, financial infrastructure identifiers. I'm not sure the actual terminology, but like class identifiers. Essentially, we have all these different types of identifiers. That's just how we communicate as human beings. I don't see an issue with humans communicating using gender identifiers, especially if there's no definitive mandation on those identifiers. People can deviate from them, accept them if they like or dislike. You don't. If someone says I'm a blah 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 gender and you've never heard that gender before, you don't have to accept in your heart that that's what they are. And if you start communicating to them and they perceive it negatively, or they start communicating to you and you perceive it negatively, you don't have to communicate to each other. And if it goes even further than that, that's what we have social structures in place like the law and things like that. So I just don't see an issue, honestly.
Well, okay, yeah, no, I understand whether if someone doesn't want to be spoken to, or if you don't want to speak to someone because they're just being absurd, you can step away. But what it's doing is it's going to cause a massive separation of people, and all it's doing is people that want to have all these gender identifications, they're going to cause a massive complex system of I'm going to use this gender identification and you're going to use that one, and they're going to spend a lot of their evolutional time learning about this identification, which when the people that are not taking this gender identification, they're going to be progressing towards a more brighter future. They're going to look at all the other different problems that we've got. What I take it as is if we're going to continue with this gender identification, it's going to cause a massive separation of people because the people with gender identifications are not going to like the people without them, and the people with them, no, the people without them are going to disagree with the people with them, or maybe not disagree, but they might not always want to use the system. Like you said, there are going to be new communication ways. If I'm using, if I'm referring to you, I will refer to you as whatever. But if you're going to have a gender identifier, this could mess around with how I speak to you. So that's going to cause a communication dysfunction where so far in our normal day-to-day life, English is perfectly fine to communicate with. There's probably a few errors here and there, and that's more of humans than the actual wordings and stuff. But when you want to have this new gender identification, all it's going to do is add more pressure onto communication, which right now in this evolutional state, we don't actually need that more pressure on how we communicate. And you can probably reply to this, but I think we need to make our closing statement soon.
I'll just make my reply also a closing statement, I guess. Um, Essentially, the way that I see it is that evolutionally, we've culturally developed our method of communication through developing our language. And through our complexity, developmental understanding of reality as we perceive reality as a species, how that's developed evolutionarily over time and become more complex. Our understandings and our methods of communicating with each other have also become more complex. That's why you see variations and changes and developments in our language. Um, to the point in our current history, I think the reason we're having all these variable people, identifying with their own genders and whatnot is because we're culturally understanding that gender itself doesn't need to be definitive in its method of communication. There's no issue with using a social identifier in terms of gender, just like we already use all these other methods of identifying ourselves through our reality for the sake of simplistic communication. And I don't think the fact that we're becoming aware that those identifiers are not definitive and thus we're becoming more complex in our expression of those identifiers, I don't think that's really an issue. And where we're looking at maybe 10 and 20 years of our history where it's confusing and we have like Z and Zir and all this, where this is just our developmental phase. We're looking at a grain of sand in terms of our timeline of development. We're always going to communicate with each other, with the various methods relatable to our current point of development. And our current point of development is using communication through language to express ourselves and interact with each other and share ideas. And the identifiers that we use, for the most part, don't cause conflictions unless we accept them to be definitive. So it's simply just understanding that they're not definitive or they're not concrete allows you to have freedom of the understanding. And you can simply choose to use identifiers for communication on your own, accept people using identifiers to communicate to you. You could choose not to do that, and use the language in a different way. That's the freedom of communication, and I don't really see an issue with people using identifiers to communicate because that's our method of communication within our current developmental process of our complex mind or whatever.
Okay, yeah. So is that your closing statement as well? My brain kind of stuttered with.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Sorry. Yeah, that's great. Yeah. So I'm gonna probably say my closing statement if I can think. Um. So overall, my view on gender identification is that it's more obsolete and we don't need it. It's very lazy, and especially with the new generations we have, the more we're developing in towards this gender identification, I feel it's more pressured by the laziness of the newer generation, which has definitely been brought up upon by technology through our texting and all that. We have set things in place like names. They have a great impact on people. If you just think of your best friend's name, you can understand everything about them just from that. So I feel that when we're trying to have a whole new gender identification, that is just that's building a whole new thing that we don't fully need or want. Well, some people may want it, but we don't need it. To communicate, we have everything already in place to have a perfectly efficient and great conversation. Unfortunately, I can't use the English very well, so my conversations are very stuttered and messed up. Um, so yeah, I feel that gender identification all it's going to do is bring more complexity to how we speak, how we talk to each other. Um,